Hi everyone. We are still in the early stages of the metaverse, but already creators, researchers, and organizations around the world are working to unlock the potential of AR and VR to transform education, workforce training, healthcare, and the global economy. The metaverse will not be built by any one organization. It will be built by a range of companies, large and small, civil society, the public sector, and millions of individual creators. That's why we at Meta are so excited that Economist Impact will be organizing a series of global events this fall and into 2023 to explore the value of the metaverse. The first event is in Northeast Asia, where industry, government, and civil society leaders have in many ways already been leading the way to help build the metaverse. As we work together on the next computing platform, it is so important that we ensure open and transparent dialogue across sectors and across regions. Thank you to Economist Impact for helping us start this important dialogue.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Charles Ross, and I'm a Principal of Policy Insights at Economist Impact. And a big welcome to this discussion today, Challenges in Governance in the Virtual World. This is the third webinar in a three-part series titled Leading the Way into the Metaverse, Northeast Asia's Potential. And big thanks to Meta for generously supporting and sponsoring this fireside chat and the virtual panel discussion, which will follow it as well. Before we get into it, just a few housekeeping items to begin. It's best to use Google Chrome, if you can, to view this webinar. You also find a box with a selection of further reading on this topic available for download. So today I'm delighted to be joined by a really great panelist, Hak-Soo Ko, who is the chairperson for the Personal Information Protection Commission of the Republic of Korea. Prior to joining the PIPC, Mr. Ko held a range of senior management positions in academia, including president of the Korea Association for Artificial Intelligence and Law from 2020 through to October 2022. He was president of the Asian Law and Economics Association from 2019 through to October 2022. President of the Korea Law and Economics Association from 2015 through to 2019, and is head of the Seoul National University Center for Law and Economics. You will find the full biography of Chairperson Hak-Soo Ko on the screen under this media player. Now, before I get into this discussion with Hak-Soo, I want to remind you all of really what we're here today to discuss. And we are actually in quite a unique position today where technology is rapidly advancing connectivity, communication, sharing, immersion, and simulation, which is all expected to come together with the creation of realistic virtual worlds, or otherwise known as the metaverse. And these virtual worlds, which have the potential to generate a lot of economic and social value. But unlike quite a few other significant periods of technological advancement, we do generally have the opportunity today to put in place the governance and safeguards needed to make these new types of immersive and instantaneous social engagements safe and secure. So today, we'll discuss what these safeguards might look like, how governments or industry might best enforce rules in the virtual world, and what lessons can be learned from existing approaches to regulating online spaces, be that video games or social networks or so on and so forth. So I'd love to get into this and welcome Chairperson Hak-Soo Ko to this discussion. It's a real pleasure to have you with me here today. And I just wanted to start, if I may, if you could share with us what the PIPC is and what you've been working on over the last couple of years in relation to the metaverse.
Yeah, PIPC in Korea was restructured about 2 years ago. We became a fully independent data protection authority within South Korea. That came along with major legal structure of data privacy area in Korea. So now we are independent data protection authority with fully fledged investigative power. So we have been conducting investigations. We have been publishing guidelines related to data protection. And in the past couple of years, we have been setting up our own internal structure to function properly as a standalone independent institution. And recently, in particular, in the past several weeks, several months, one big case came out, which is about data collection by some of the largest technology companies in the world, including Google and Meta. And we imposed a total fine of roughly 70 million US dollars. And that's, obviously a pretty significant amount. And outside of Europe and the US, perhaps, this is relatively uncommon enforcement activities, I guess. So we are very active in terms of enforcing data privacy law. And also, we're having a lot of discussions with authorities located in Europe, the US, and other countries. And in particular, with the EU GDPR, there is a scheme called adequacy assessment. And we have been working with European Commission, and we obtained adequacy status late last year. And also we are having discussions with the UK authority, and we will perhaps be getting UK's adequacy assessments in the coming weeks. And we're monitoring new developments in some of the newly developed technology and businesses, and we are monitoring and issuing guidelines in this area. And so today, later on, perhaps we'll discuss some more details related to the metaverse and other newly emerging technologies.
Thank you. I can really see how that collaboration and working with other jurisdictions, other governments around the world is really, really key for obviously regulating the online space. We know a lot of these different sort of regulators are thinking about the metaverse and putting in place plans to regulate it. Some of them coming out, like the National Data Policy Committee here in South Korea, as part of their Ministry of Science and ICT, coming out and saying, we're not going to make the mistake of regulating a new service with existing law. And we've got other markets, UK, etc., sort of thinking about it in this sort of way as well. How important do you think it is to address these privacy issues at this early stage of the creation, when we're thinking specifically about the metaverse?
Metaverse, well, at least for now, it's very hard to define. If you ask different people, all different people will perhaps come up with different answers. So in that respect, the concept of metaverse is changing every day, meaning giving different meanings to every different people. And one thing that we need to be careful about is not to stifle or discourage innovation. In this area of new technologies and new challenges, we need to give enough of space for new trials and new attempts. At the same time, if we do not give sufficient safeguard, we do not build enough of safeguard, and if the users or the general public does not believe in the future prospect, or if they do not give enough of trust in this area, they will not use these new gadgets or not use these new services. So our kind of balance or quandary for us is to give a balance between encouraging new efforts without fear of being sanctioned. At the same time, establishing sufficient safeguards so that the general public will give enough of trust in this area. And one particular difficulty is because the whole concept and whole technology area is changing very rapidly. It's very difficult to set up specific rules. So we can perhaps need to set up principles and need to be flexible in terms of interpreting the principles and applying the principles in the actual real cases. So the difficulty is not just about coming up with principles, but also how to interpret and apply in individual specific cases. So we are for now monitoring the development in this new area.
Yeah, on the trust point that you just called out, I do agree. That's a really valuable piece that we need to resolve, because we need to better trust this as a safe space. And I'm thinking about that in terms of some of the most vulnerable online participants, which are children who are going to be using, working and living within these virtual worlds, using the metaverse. Because you can see it's a different experience to the internet, where you might have, say, a parent sitting beside a child seeing what's happening. If you're in a virtual world, there is sort of less sort of visibility from a parent or a guardian over what a child might be doing. I just wonder, from that perspective, are you thinking at the moment about those privacy issues, specifically around children, and thinking about what sort of policies might need to be sort of put in place to sort of protect them within the metaverse?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And we recently published a guideline about data processing related to children and adolescents. And that's not particularly about the metaverse per se, but it's about generally about online activities involving children and younger adults. And what we try to come up with the guideline is to give sort of guides to the businesses, service providers, and also to device makers. And we also said to the guardians or parents, parents also need to be careful about when they monitor or allow their children to engage in all sorts of online activities. So through these guidelines, we try to give guidance to different stakeholders with different roles in the whole sphere. And also, as I mentioned, we need to be flexible. So we set up a working group involving outside experts. So we continue to have discussions about the new developments in this area, and if needed, we'll come up with revised guidelines or further updates to the guidelines. So we are monitoring and we are ready to give more updates.
So from that perspective, you very much see this as sort of the start of the journey where things will need to be continually sort of revised and addressed and collaborated on with the industry as we move forward. This is sort of how you see it sort of playing out, if you like.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's correct observation.
Excellent, fantastic. We're just about out of time, Pak-Soo. Is there anything else you wanted to sort of add? What is sort of top of your list of sort of priorities at the moment? Anything else you wanted to share with us in terms of what the PIPC are sort of doing now and thinking about in terms of the future?
Yeah, I mean, one big area we are focusing on or we are monitoring is sort of newly developing technologies. And the metaverse, in that sense, fits this area very well because the metaverse, some businesses could use just using equipment, mobile devices or PC based. But in some other cases, the new types of equipment will be used, such as head-mounted display. And using, new type of devices sometimes mean gathering new types of data. So there could be augmented reality, there could be virtual reality, and depending on different types of services, different types of technologies, there could be different types of data being collected and utilized, and oftentimes different types of data or can be combined to give new types of implications. So we are constantly monitoring as to what kind of data is being collected with what kind of new implications. So we continue to monitor and try to collaborate and give more useful guidances.
Excellent. It certainly sounds like you have your plate full, sort of responding, dealing, and trying to get ahead of some of these challenges which you are facing. Unfortunately, we are out of time. It was a very quick discussion. Chairperson Haxiko, is really sort of a real pleasure to sort of spend a little bit of time talking to. Really interesting to hear about your sort of the flexible approach that you are taking with this. There is, of course, a need for regulation and the enforcement, which you talked about a little bit earlier, but there is a sort of a principles-based approach as well, which industry needs to sort of be aware of and follow. And all of this is critical to be flexible in order to not stifle the innovation. And we've talked a little bit earlier on this sort of this metaverse series about the really exciting sort of innovations in creativity and economic advantages that can come from virtual worlds. And so important to sort of keep that in mind so we're not stifling that innovation, which of course you are doing and you called out. It's been really fascinating. I've really enjoyed our discussion. Once again, thank you very much for your time and for sharing your thoughts and in the view of PIPC with us here today. I hope you all enjoyed the discussion out there. Again, a big thank you to Meta for sponsoring this fireside chat and the panel discussion which will come. Please do stay online for that panel discussion and listen to that. There's going to be some really interesting points and discussion coming out of that as well. So once again, thank you, Chairperson Haxiko. I really appreciate your time. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this panel discussion, Challenges in Governance in Virtual Worlds. My name is Charles Ross, Principal of Policy and Insights at Economist Impact, and it's a real pleasure to be able to spend the next 45 minutes with you, focus on this really fascinating topic. Big thanks, first up, to Meta for generously supporting this interactive virtual panel discussion. And let me introduce our really fascinating panelists that we have with us here today. First up, Rob Sherman, who is the Vice President and Deputy Chief Privacy Officer for Policy at Meta. He and his team have worked closely with internal and external privacy and policy experts, along with product, engineering, research, and other teams to protect people's privacy across the company's suite of products and technologies. He's worked to develop approaches within the company and in public policy to promote the responsible development of new technologies like artificial intelligence and augmented reality. And I'm really fascinated to hear how he's now approaching this in terms of the metaverse as well. Next up, we have Yuto Kunitake, who is the Chairman, NPO Virtual Rights Council. He's been involved in over 30 policy recommendations a year. Mr. Kunitake is exceptionally knowledgeable, particularly in the creative economy field. And he and the 1,000 members of Virtual Rights are the creators and users who are native to the metaverse creator economy, making them the experts with the latest knowledge from the cutting edge of this new social movement. So a big welcome to the discussion. And lastly, we have Tammy Lin, who is Professor National Cheng Chai University. She's also the Director of the International Masters Program in International Communication Studies and the Chair of the Human Subject Review Board at NCCU. In addition, she serves as the President of the Taiwan Academy for Information Association. So a big thank you to each one of my panelists for taking the time to join us today. If you do want to read a little bit more about them, their full biographies are on the screen underneath this media play if you want to sort of navigate to that. And please note that Yuto Kunitake will be speaking today in Japanese, so please see the screen for closed caption translation to English as we go through. And before I do get into the discussion, just want to remind you all again of why we are here and why we're discussing this today. And so if you weren't just listening to the fireside chat, you will have heard our discussion, my discussion of how best we should be governing this confluence of new technologies, which are rapidly advancing connectivity, communications, sharing, immersion, and simulation to create more interconnected and realistic virtual worlds. And on this panel, we want to continue that discussion and focus on the kinds of safeguards these types of new types of immersive and instantaneous social engagements require, as well as how can the government or industry best enforce rules within the virtual world. So lots to cover. Also got some really great questions from the audience coming in as well. So thank you for taking the time to submit those. I'll get to as many of those as we can. So let me get straight into it. I actually just want to start by asking a question for each of you to get your view on this, because I'm sitting here and I'm sure many of you are out there as well. We're all experienced with the internet as we know it, and we're familiar with the sort of safeguards which have been put in place to govern it. These are ranging from sort of data privacy to really important stuff around minimizing child exploitation, slander, protection of IP. There's lots of discussion about this, but I really want to sort of understand, how is the metaverse different? And what kinds of safeguards or different kinds of safeguards do we think these new types of immersive and instantaneous social engagements might require? And Rob, I might start with you, if I may, just to get your feelings of how is the metaverse different in terms of how we should be thinking about it in terms of those safeguards?
Well, thank you so much, Charles, and to everybody for being here. It's a really important time to be having this conversation, and I'm excited about the engagement that we'll be having. When I think about the metaverse, we've talked a lot about these different technologies: augmented reality, virtual reality, and I think as you've said, the metaverse is really the next iteration of today's mobile internet. So if we think about this as sort of the next platform or series of platforms on which humans as a society will communicate, there's a lot of different aspects that need to apply there in terms of how we think about governance. And so the first thing I would say is, when you think about the way that the internet is governed or any of our interactions today, there's multiple layers of interaction and multiple layers of governance. There's global and international standards, there's national rules that exist, there are platform standards that different technologies and different platforms apply, and then there are additional rules that, for example, as a part of this forum, the economist might decide to adopt. And so I think that kind of multi-layered approach to governance is going to exist in the metaverse, just like it exists on the internet today. One of the things, though, that I think is different is, and what's kind of quintessentially different about the metaverse as compared to the internet, is this idea of presence, the idea of technology bringing us together with people and in places that we couldn't otherwise be. And so when I think about a lot of the regulatory and governance questions are the same are similar. We don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to how we think about many kinds of regulatory questions that we have today. But a lot of these questions around presence, around interaction, around the physical space that we inhabit are going to be a lot of the focus of additional governance protections that all of those layers that I talked about are going to have to approach it with.
Tammy, would you agree with that that's sort of the main difference between the metaverse and sort of the internet as we currently know it? Is that presence piece, that sort of the way we're going to interact differently?
Yes, I echo with Rob, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity to join the symposium and the conversation. I think it's really meaningful at this time, because we are facing the era that we are going to the metaverse, which is transferring the two-dimensional platform, like it's flat on the screen, to a three-dimensional space where we are inside the space. So that's the main difference in Web 2.0 or the current internet when we're using. We're using the HTML technique to link all the information together. on a blank web page. So it's flat. And all the information is presented on the screen. So there's a distance between users and the screen. But in the metaverse, if we are talking about the virtual reality, which is the most immersive technology, that your user, we are actually inside the space. So we directly talk to each other, like Charles. If we are in the metaverse, I will be directly talking to you, and we might be shaking hands or hug each other. So we would compare that as a physical world. So I would put the metaverse interaction as a mediated face-to-face interaction. So it's just like the real world face-to-face interaction, but it's mediated. So it's mediated by the technology, whether it's virtual reality or other immersive technology. So that really changes everything, because when it's 2D, we can put words there to warn you, the next upcoming, the content, it might be, dangerous or bad for your kids. But right now, you just directly see it. There's no intervention or warning. And the other thing is that we directly interact with each other using our virtual body. So we embody in this virtual body that makes things really different. In a 2D world or in 2D internet, people might say bad things to you using words to your account. But right now in three-dimensional metaverse interaction, they directly say it to your face. Like last time my student, he was wandering around the metaverse, and someone he didn't know how to control everything, so one girl just said to him, "You're so stupid." So just directly like that. So there's no way that you can prevent them or to warn the people. And so if you want to sue that girl, it would be hard in the metaverse era, because the current law will apply that you would track the account, but how would you know whether that's the person behind that account? So there's lots of challenges in the metaverse. If we talk about the self-governance or the governance. So there is a lot that we can talk about in the later discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tammy. Certainly painting a picture of it being much more complicated and difficult within the metaverse. And I'll get onto some of the tools or techniques we might be able to leverage to sort of make it a bit easier for us as well. Yuto, let me get your view on this. Would you agree with Tammy and Rob, in terms of how we've described the challenges we might have here in terms of governing the metaverse? Or do you have a view I know you work a lot with the creator economy. Is there something different we should be thinking about here?
はい、今、ただいまご紹介に預かりました NPO 人バーチャルエツの国武です。現状認識については、ロブさんとタミさんのおっしゃる通りかなと思います。その上でですね、じゃあ実際どのような対策が必要なのかというところで議論が分かれてくると思うんですけれども、まずパーソナルスペース機能やブロック機能、ミュート機能の実装は、これは非常にプラットフォーマーに求められる点だと思います。メタバースやリアルタイムなコミュニケーションが行われておりまして、即時に自己防衛できる手段が必要だと考えます。不適切な行動を取るユーザーを通報できる機能というのも必要だと思うんですけれども、やはり対処に時間がかかる通報機能よりも自己防衛が可能な機能の重要性が非常に高いと考えております。また興味深いアンケート調査もあります。当人が協力して行ったメタバースとハラスメント、これはセクシュアルハラスメントに限られません。パワーハラスメントなども含まれます。このアンケート調査では、約 60% 以上のユーザーがメタバースにおいて何らかのハラスメントを体験したとのデータがあります。しかし面白いことに 70% 以上が法律による制限というのは望んでいません。これはプラットフォームの利用規約や自主規制で十分だとの意見が大半を占めています。実際に規制を行う際には国ごとに文化や価値観、宗教が異なります。そのためですね、一律に法律で制限するよりは、プラットフォーマーがユーザーに様々な選択肢を提供するといった方が、より現実味が高いのかなと考えております。以上です。
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Yuto. You called out a really interesting data point. I just might want to drill in there for a second, which was that you said that 60% of respondents already in these very early days of the metaverse have already felt harassment to themselves. That's sort of a large amount. You also called out some of the the tools that we need to have in place to try and sort of monitor this. Things like the ability to record everything which goes on in the metaverse, the ability to mute other people. These types of tools sound sort of really important to do. Rob, I want to get your sort of view on that in terms of sort of the technologies and tools that might be we might be able to deploy to be able to sort of make people safe from a tech point of view.
Absolutely. And I think this goes, Charles, to the question that we were discussing before around the different layers of protection and the different ways that the metaverse will be governed. Because as is true in the physical world or on the internet, there are generally applicable rules. But I think you're right to say, and I agree with a lot of what you said as well, that the technology actually gives us some opportunities to add additional protections that don't exist in the physical world or might not exist in the same way on today's internet. And I'd identified two areas where that's true. I think the first, which you started to discuss, is protections that individuals can have and ways that they can use technology to protect themselves. So for example, in Meta's Horizon Worlds product, I can say, I don't want people to come within 6 feet of me. That's a protection that I don't have in the physical world, but I can say if somebody's bothering me, I can prevent them from coming close to me. I can block somebody if they're bothering me. I can mute them. I think a lot of us might like the ability to mute people in the real world. That doesn't exist yet, but it does exist in the metaverse. And so I think those are all really important. And it's an area where we're actually quite focused in terms of the development of new tools to help empower people. But there's another layer in addition where there's an opportunity and where we've spent a lot of time focusing, which is empowering the people who control worlds to have tools that help them manage their spaces as well. So just like if I were to go into a restaurant, the proprietor of the restaurant would have some ability to take action. When we're building platforms to enable virtual spaces, we need to think about how can a creator receive reports, which mentioned, of concerns that people are misbehaving in their space. How can they have the ability to block people or take action against people or set rules? I think one of the most interesting aspects of thinking about the diversity of virtual spaces is going to be the fact that just like physical spaces have lots of different social and cultural expectations about how you'd behave in them, different virtual spaces will have the same. And so one of the things that we'll have to be thinking about is how to build technology that enables creators to set the rules for their spaces and then enforce them over time.
I just want to touch on one of the points that you two made, and you sort of referenced there as well, Rob, was I can see recording of sort of interactions and activities in the metaverse can be a really important thing because it obviously creates a record of what's happened. So if there are some issues that need to be investigated, then there it is. But is it actually practically going to be possible? I mean, if we've got billions of people on the metaverse and we're recording everything which goes on there, we're talking about video here, and we know that these virtual worlds are going to need to sort of high amounts of bandwidth because of the quality we need in terms of that interaction in the video. Is going to have to be high for it to be realistic as possible. Is it actually going to be feasibly possible to be able to record all of that data, that information? You see some issues with that, Rob?
I do. I mean, I think this is something, unsurprisingly, that we've spent a lot of time thinking about, because the fact is people are not going to be willing to use our products or anybody's virtual reality products if they're not safe, but they also aren't going to be willing to use them if their privacy isn't protected. And as you mentioned, that's particularly an area that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about. And I think realistically, it's certainly not feasible to record everything that goes on in the metaverse, just like it's not feasible to record everything that goes on the internet or every phone conversation. And I think from a privacy perspective, you wouldn't want that to be the case anyway. And so the way that we've approached this in Horizon Worlds, which I think is an interesting template for how we might approach it in future technologies as well, is that a 2-minute buffer of your conversation is stored on your device locally, and it's constantly overwritten. So for example, as we're having this conversation, we might have a local buffer on each of our devices. And if one of us decided to report something, then and only then would that 2-minute recording be sent to the to Meta if it's reported to Meta, or to the world creator if it's the world creator. And the idea there would be that people would have the ability to share information if something is happening that's concerning them, but as a routine matter, conversations wouldn't be recorded, they wouldn't be monitored, and I think that's also important for people to feel that they have a private and free space where they can communicate.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. And Tammy, I want to ask you just to touch on what Ito said before as well. He said this two interesting data points. One, which was 60% of respondents have experienced harassment already as part of the research they've done. And the other point is that 70% of the users, these early stage users, don't want to see any regulation sort of governing these virtual worlds. So do these data points sort of surprise you? Bearing in mind this, we're at the very early days of the metaverse, Tammy?
Well, I, as an early stage user of metaverse, I myself, to respond to the first point, that I myself encounter some harassment that I perceive as harassment. So the first point that I would want to point out is we need to understand how people feel about harassment and perceive safety and boundary in metaverse across ages and cultures. Right now, people see metaverse as a three-dimensional video space, video game space. So people feel that, oh, it's your avatar, so I can do whatever I want to the avatar. It's just the avatar. But it's different from the two-dimensional video game, which is presented on the screen because you saw your avatar on the screen. That's not you. But in the three-dimensional virtual reality-based metaverse, you embody yourself. So for example, I was in the metaverse hanging out with other people, strangers, but there's a kid directly came to me and I couldn't see what he did until he rushed to another guy and stick his finger to his nose. And then I realized the kid just stick his finger into my nose. And then I realized, oh, you can't be too that close to me. I don't feel comfortable. I directly asked him not to do that, and he stopped. So that's the that's the difference, because I embody in this virtual body. So the avatar is me is different from the video game that you can do whatever you want to, the playful or cartoon-like avatar. And the second thing is that I was watching this social video on Metaverse, which is Venus for Meta, and I just sat there, but there's a guy next to me and he's snoring. I can hear snoring very, very loudly, very closely, just like he's next to me. And I couldn't do anything, so I walked away, but I kept hearing his snoring. I do feel the harassment. So I can understand why 70% of the people in the early stage did not want regulations, because they think it's it's playground for them. It's very interesting and very exciting. I agree with that, but I do think that people have the right to choose how to protect themselves. So responding to the recording issue, I fully agree that recording is very necessary to serve as the evidence of the immediate interaction. If you want to report something, or you want to say, hey, I feel uncomfortable. But what about if we are allowed to have the option that when I enter the metaverse this time, I want it recorded the whole time? So it's just like in the physical world, I can choose, when I enter this social interaction, I want my phone to record everything every time. And maybe if I have that option, I won't be too anxious that to report everything within 2 minutes with a buffer. And I will feel more safer, and I can tell people, hey, I'm recording everything. If you are going to harass my virtual body, maybe you should think about it twice. So maybe this kind of option afforded to users, that would be also considerable for the current metaverse design.
That sounds like a good suggestion. And sort of just drawing into that a little bit, Yuto, I would like to get your sort of view on this one. If we're at the point now where sort of 70% of people don't want to have sort of regulation, there is going to be regulation coming up. Ultimately, it is inevitable. It is going to happen. So where we are now, I just wonder what sort of roles should artists, developers, consumers, also the sort of people you talk to day in, day out, what role they should have in establishing these new rules for the metaverse, Yuto?
はい。メタバースをより持続可能的なものにしていくためには、ユーザーやクリエイター、もちろんこれに一般の利用者も含まれますが、それぞれの利益団体を通じて要望を提出していく必要があると考えております。これは例えばメタバースには限定されないんですけれども、クリエイター支援を掲げて当選した漫画家の国会議員が日本には存在します。そういった政治家をユーザーやクリエイターが応援することも一つの方法として考えられます。また、個人個人や専門家ではなくとも、専門家に情報を提供することは、これは当然できます。1000の会員を抱える私の NPO はですね、会員の声を集めて、専門チームで分析をした後に、行政や議員に政策提言を行っています。また、ユーザーやクリエイターの意見を取りまとめる機関として、例えばですけれども、NPO とプラットフォーマーが情報提供のパートナーシップを結ぶことも今後考えられると思います。
Yeah, it sounds like some really good suggestions there, Yuto. And I wonder, sort of Rob, from your perspective, we've got lots of views, lots of really interesting sort of input from early adopters of the metaverse. There's going to be a need to balance this with governments as well, and then of course hopefully the other billion people who are going to start joining the metaverse. How do we find that sort of balance between the needs of government, the needs of everyday people, and the needs of creators on the platform, Rob?
Well, it's a really important challenge, and I think now is a particularly important time to be discussing it, because if you think about the analogy that we used at the beginning of this conversation about the metaverse being analogous to the mobile internet, I kind of think about us being at the dial-up internet stage of the metaverse right now. We're very early in the evolution of the technology. Not everyone has it yet, and the technology is being built in parallel to a lot of these governance questions that we've been discussing, and so I think if that's the case, then we also have a real opportunity right now to work together and think about the right ways to balance this. The other thing that I think is unique is if you believe in this metaverse to internet analogy, that there's going to be one metaverse, not a metaverse and a Google metaverse and every company having their own. If there's one, just like there's one internet, then that also means it can't be companies like ours making unilateral decisions about how these things will work. And I think that's a really important foundational question. Obviously, we'll make decisions about how to build our products, but when we think about what the governance of the metaverse as a whole should look like, that is a collective effort that all of the kinds of stakeholders that you talked about need to participate in. And so I think there are a couple of different ways we can do this. One is there are multinational bodies and NGOs and think tanks that are having a lot of these conversations. I know, for example, that the World Economic Forum is doing a project with the XR Association on how we should think about best practices in the metaverse. There are also, because of the interoperability, there are going to have to be technical discussions about how to set technical standards for how different metaverse services will interact. So I think that's one big area. Another is really building conversations with experts around the world, recognizing that the needs of people in different parts of the world are going to look very different. And even within a particular country or region, there are lots of unique perspectives. And so one of the things that we've done there, we spent about $50 million in funding research around the world, including a bunch of research in the Asia Pacific region on these specific issues, really to develop expertise in academia around how to think about users' perspectives and government perspectives and all of the different equities that are needed. But the last thing that I'll say that I think is an early experiment, but a really interesting one. We've been doing some work with the Deliberative Democracy Lab at Stanford University around what we're calling community forums. And so we've kicked off this effort with about 6,000 people from countries around the world to look at some of these foundational questions and consider perspectives from different kinds of users with different levels of experience with virtual worlds, also government perspectives and expert perspectives, and really try to synthesize a view on how to think about all of these different considerations and how they should balance against each other. I don't think we have the answers yet, but I'm pretty committed to the fact that if we don't have these kinds of collaborative conversations, we're going to get to a place where where some particular equity isn't thought about in the way that it needs to be. And so having these conversations early is going to be really important.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. And we actually talked about this sort of interoperability sort of question, which you touched on earlier in one of the earlier sort of discussions, events that we had for this series. So if you do get an opportunity to watch that again, please do go back, because it is key. Without that interoperability, we are going to have fairly sort of closed systems. But obviously, when we have interoperability, it does make it more complicated because we have sort of much more global scale and reach around this. Rob's talked about some really sort of interesting things you're doing at Meta from sort of an industry-driven perspective around this. I wonder that maybe, Tammy, you have a sort of a view on this, and this is a question which has come from the audience here. The question is, what can facilitate global consensus on governance in the virtual world? So Rob's been talking about sort of, I guess, a bottom-up approach to this. But is there a need for sort of a UN style organization to sort of step in here and take some ownership of this, or is that the wrong way to go? Tammy?
Well, I think currently it's very early, so all the governments are still watching it evolving, and they want to see whether it will evolve to some level, or maybe it's a bubble to burst and to save as another virtual world. But I think currently the whole world didn't have a standardized consensus about how to regulate internet. Like we see different technology giants purchasing different social media platforms right now. So we didn't have global consensus toward the internet. So I don't think there will be a consensus toward the three-dimensional, especially VR-based metaverse. It will be really hard. Right now, I do think the government needs to understand the differences between the 3D space and the 2D space, especially the embodied experiences. And I do think the first step for the governance consensus is to understand the embodied experiences is very related to personal space and perception of safety and boundary. Maybe we can, work on the regulations toward that. So what if someone said, I got harassed in the virtual space. I really want to sue this person because I felt very uncomfortable. I felt damaged or something. And how do the real world government deal with this? I do think it's imminent right now. So this is the direction that the government can toward. But right now, I do think the more imminent thing for the regulation is for the platforms to do self-regulations. So remember, we talked about the 3D VR-based metaverse is currently looks like a playground, virtual playground for everyone. But I just, experienced the latest Meta Quest Pro by Meta. It actually can directly detect your facial expressions and directly portray it to the avatar. I do think that's very important visual cues to reflect everyone's emotions and responses, and that these can actually facilitate the communication processes and maybe the social interactions. Because if I don't know what you're thinking, people tend to harass each other, just like playing with dolls and poke you and stick you and to see how you react. But right now, if you can see my eyebrows moving and I have my smiles or my angry face, maybe that would really help the social interactions. So I do think these are the two directions. And I know that Meta or Rec Rooms, they also did the self-regulations that to make people's virtual body transparent when you are really close to that. I do think it's good right now, but I don't think it will be lasting forever in the future, because maybe I just want to hug your body, and then if you're transparent, that wouldn't work. So I do think there will be more complicated and sophisticated features for us to understand how to socially interact with each other. The third thing I would like to say is, for government, maybe there can be a global consensus about the digital literacy in the metaverse. I do think that literacy is very important to engage and to build around the world, to understand, it's cross-culture and cross-ages. I haven't met so many kids online, except in metaverse. There are just a bunch of kids. In the real world, people tend to act and social interact with each other within similar groups. But in metaverse, you can see you can interact with anyone, cross cultures and ages. That's very different. So the digital literacy to react and interact with these different various people, I do think the research is needed at this stage. So I really appreciate Meta to have all the research fund. I myself also received one of the research funds. So I'm going to focus on how to people respond to different reactions in virtual reality, and how do they perceive the safety and boundary, how do they respond to this cross-culturally. I do think that's very important. So research and self-regulation for the platforms and also the governments from the global consensus are also needed. Thank you.
Yeah, really good to call out that digital literacy piece there. I mean, we are sort of in the early days here, of course. We've got early adopters there. And lots of people are limited really by sort of relatively high costs and barriers to sort of getting involved in the metaverse. But obviously the expectation is we're going to have billions of people involved in this with those different levels of sort of digital literacy and different sort of expectations for it. And I just want to touch on that point there around those societal expectations for behavior within the metaverse, because if it is realistic as we sort of expect it to be, you can understand that if you're sort of operating in, say, a playground, for example, there will be different expectations of how you should be able to sort of behave within that compared to, say, if you're in a nightclub. So context will have sort of an important part of this in terms of operating in there, and those sort of societal norms, which will look different in compared to Australia, where I'm joining you from today, between the US, between other markets around Asia and in North Asia as well. It will look a little bit different. And I just want to get to the panel's sort of view on that. Maybe start with you, Rob, on that societal expectations piece. Is that going to be sort of an added level of sort of complication if you're managing these sort of virtual worlds, or is it going to be sort of self-governing in terms of those societal expectations? How do you sort of manage around that?
Well, I think it's going to be both. Just like the physical world, as you point out, the behavior in a playground and the behavior in a club are going to be very different. And the people that control those spaces make decisions about what they want to allow. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about is how do we build technology that when somebody creates a space, in Horizon Worlds, for example, we have a comedy club, we have playgrounds, we have a huge range of different spaces that people have created. And so one piece of this is enabling people to set rules so that they can communicate to other people who who enter their world what the expectations are in those places. And I talked earlier about building tools to help those people enforce those rules. But there are also different expectations in different kinds of spaces. So for example, if I'm standing in a performance venue, the expectations for how my voice carries might be different when I'm standing in the audience versus standing on the stage. And so a big part of what we need to think about, in addition to enabling creators of worlds to set the standards that apply, is also doing our part to make sure that the technology works in the way that aligns with whatever those expectations are. I think it's worth saying also that there are, as in today's internet, there are going to be some kinds of behaviors, and we've alluded to them, that are just unacceptable anywhere. And there are laws that apply regardless of whether you're in the metaverse, whether you're on a website, whether you're in a physical space, that are going to prohibit people from engaging in particularly bad conduct. And I think that's important as well. And so making sure that governments have a role there is going to be critical.
You called out sort of bad content, bad sort of behavior and activities in the metaverse there, Rob. And we do have a question from the audience here, which we may all disagree with, or we may all agree with. I would like to get your sort of view on this. And it is around the punishment of the sorts of behavior which might happen within the metaverse. And the question is, should it be standardized across countries? And should it be so severe as to serve as a real deterrent for people? So severe enough, I guess they're sort of implying as severe as it would be in the real world in terms of those punishments. So I guess that's part of it. Should it be as severe, the punishment for for behavior or bad behavior within the sort of virtual world. So one question out of that. The other one is should it be standardized across countries, which I think is nigh on impossible, but love to get your sort of view on that one. Tammy, maybe if I can ask you this one first, get your view on that in terms of the punishment.
I think right now the whole world is not decentralized. So all the laws goes back to individual countries, and they have different standards, linking and tracking the accounts or the information happened in the metaverse or on the web. So I do think the participant is asking whether that should be a standardized rule to do that. So I think the ideal situation is that the social media platform would allow the users to directly express how they feel, and to let the users to decide whether it's severe or not. And then right now, I do think it still has to go back to each own country to do that. Only this global consensus can be achieved if there is really a United Nations for virtual metaverse or something. Otherwise, I think the social media platform can has a standardized rule governing the virtual space, but each user still has to go back to their own country to pursue a law. But the other problem is if the other one who does this conduct badly, that is not in your country, then there's a problem, because you need to go to the other country and then apply which country's rules or anything. So I do think that currently the government needs to understand is different. The 3D world, virtual VR-based metaverse is very different than the 2D world. So how we can deal with this is a really great question for the government to think about. And if there's a cross something, how do you deal with that? Because there will probably be more and more reports in the future.
Excellent. Thank you. Just one quick follow-up question, maybe for you, maybe for Rob. Is if we're thinking about sort of the scale of the crime and whether it's like for like between the virtual world and the real world, is, for example, murder in the virtual world, should it be treated the same as it is in the real world? Tammy, Rob, Yuto, got a view on that one? It's a tough one to put you on the spot. Yuto.
はい、ありがとうございます。メタバースにおける罰則については、既存の SNS やオンライン空間を規制するアプローチから学べることがいくつかあります。過去の事例から見るとですね、Twitter や Facebook などのプラットフォームに表現の自由を求める動きがありました。これはアメリカ合衆国のフロリダの州法 SB7072 というものです。これはプラットフォームが表現の自由を守らないといけないという法律なんですけれども、こちらフロリダ州がプラットフォームが公的機関以上の影響力を持っていると判断したためです。しかしですね、この法律はプラットフォーマーの表現の自由を侵害するとして合衆国憲法違反になりました。つまり、プラットフォーマーに対する規制は慎重であるべきだと、司法が考えていることになります。これは日本でも同様です。また、メタバースプラットフォームである、ホライゾンですとか VR チャットにはすでにパーソナルスペース機能が存在します。これら非常に素晴らしい取り組みでして、VR チャットは初期設定でパーソナルスペースが設定されており、これは解除しなければ非常に安全です。これらを踏まえるとですね、罰則を設けるというよりは、むしろ、プラットフォーマーにパーソナルスペース機能などの自己防衛手段の技術的な実装を求めるような法的な努力義務などが考えられると思います。特に自由なアバター表現と匿名性はですね、多くの一般ユーザーだけではなく、性的なマイノリティにとっても非常に望ましいものになると、考えております。もちろん、被害を防ぐためにそのインスタンスに参加する人が事前にルールを確認できる仕組みというのも、罰則と合わせて検討する必要があると思います。以上です。
Excellent. Thank you, Yuto. And I just want to ask you one more question. We've got sort of about 3 minutes left, and this is just around and this is a question from the audience, as we continue to build out governance and protection for communities interacting with the metaverse. How do we balance the creative freedom for users, which is a lot of the work you do, Yuto, with safeguarding the guardrails that prevent offensive content? So how do we sort of safeguard the creative freedom within it? Any thoughts, Yuto?
はい。技術的なセーフガードについてはいろいろな考え方が あります。先ほど現実と仮想世界の関係性について、ロブさんが述べられていたんですけれども、アジア、特に日本のユーザークリエイターは現実世界と、ある程度、考えを切り離すことを好みます。これはツイッター等でも匿名ユーザーの割合が日本は非常に高いです。しかしですね、社会的な、そういった規制を求める声っていうのが、仮想世界でのユーザーの振る舞いに一定の影響を与えていることっていうのは、やはり否定はできません。ここは今後1年の間に、現実世界と仮想世界のお互いの価値観の相互作用というのが目に見えて拡大すると考えております。
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Yuto. Really interesting. We are unfortunately just about out of time today. We've covered quite a lot of ground. I hope you sort of enjoyed the journey as we've gone through this. What I find particularly interesting is that we're talking about this so really early on in the development of what is sort of a really sort of game-changing sort of platform technology, however you want to sort of describe these virtual worlds we're talking about. So there is an opportunity to sort of frame what it should be and learn from what we've seen in the past. You all called out that it's not the internet, it is different because it's really got that presence aspect to it. So it needs to be, we need to learn from the internet, but we need to think about this in a different way, and to some extent sort of more complicated because of that. And it's really important to get those safeguards and guardrails in place, because for what Yuto mentioned earlier, we're already seeing with really early adopters, some 60% of respondents are being harassed already within this space. And once sort of we get to the next sort of billion or so people using this, that's a really high percentage of users. So we need to sort of put the things in place to be able to protect them. We need to understand what those things need to be, whether it's a communication between government and the interest groups as well. Lots of information to be gathered at this early stage to understand the best ways of doing this. The enforcement piece, I think, again, it's a really complicated piece here. There is going to be sort of societal sort of influence over this and behaviours, but there's absolutely a role for some law enforcement, and how that is done and enforced is again that's another challenge, which requires lots of talking, lots of collaboration, a lot of stuff that Rob is doing at Meta in terms of going out there and speaking to the market and users about this. Lots of coordination with governments required as well. I suspect this is the third in a three-part series of these discussions around virtual worlds we've been having. I suspect we'll be talking about this a lot more over the next sort of at least the next 5 years, which I think is a sort of a time frame where people are saying that is where we're going to need that sort of period of time before we get this widespread adoption of this. So it's sort of a few years away, but actually not that far away, and lots more discussions needed to be had. So I'm going to leave it there. A big thank you to everybody for joining us here today. Big thank you to Rob, to Yuto, to Tammy for sharing your insights and your thoughts about virtual worlds. Has been really interesting and fascinating. Again, a big thank you to Meta for supporting not just this webinar, but the whole series of webinars that we've been having over the last couple of months. And thank you to all of you for taking your time to submit your questions and to listening to us here today. So thank you to my speakers. Thank you to all of you, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.